Center for the Arts promotes, showcases, and supports the arts from across the African diaspora. As part of NIA Center's work, we're proud to showcase to you a series of artist conversations as part of our Left of Center program. Left of Center is a 2-year artist incubator that supports the careers of emerging Black artists working across a wide range of disciplines. And as part of the Left of Center program, you're here to listen to a series of artist conversations from folks like Sarah Ty Black, Kevin Reigh, and more. These conversations are meant to support emerging artists in propelling their careers forward from everything from grant writing, developing artist statements, and empowering yourself as a Black creative in this city. Stay tuned for more, and if you have any questions, you can always email NIA Center at info@niacenter.org, or you can follow us online at NIA Center as well across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks so much and enjoy.
Today we're talking about grants and essentially the ways in which artists can get money in order to resource their projects, their professional development, and ultimately their careers. And for emerging artists in particular, and Black artists in particular, grants can be a particularly challenging and tricky sort of endeavor to work on if it's your first time. So today we're joined by Kevin Reigh, and he is going to lead us through a conversation about grants, how they work, supporting documentation, budgets, how does it all come together? And I think you're so well positioned to help us through this conversation based on your background as a granting officer as well as an artist. But I'll let you introduce yourself for us.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Reigh. I'm a writer, spoken word performer, lots of experience as a grant writer, worked for a bunch of different arts organizations in that capacity, writing grants and helping to organize events and that sort of thing. And now I currently serve as a community arts program manager at the Toronto Arts Council.
Yeah, so you've been on both sides of the field, both writing grants and then reading artist grants or community organizations grants and sort of assessing and supporting them through the process. We could start off distinguishing between the different kinds of grants there are. So particularly creation grants versus a professional development grant, what's the difference?
So a professional development grant, as the name suggests, the focus is on, providing the applicant with resources that help them to, financial resources, which then help them to develop particular skills that will help them develop their career. I keep saying develop, but it's the best, most applicable term. So, and it'll differ from art discipline. So, within, say, the dance program at Toronto Arts Council, there is funding where you can get professional development, and then also through theater and all the different arts disciplines. But what it really entails is getting financial support. Let's say, for example, because I use the dance example, let's say you wanted to take a weekend intensive with a practitioner who's an expert in the Dunham technique or something of that nature. You can apply for a professional development grant, and it will pay whatever fees involved, and then also pay you as an artist to partake in that. Like, that's just one way. There are other forms of professional development. Mm-hmm. It is open to, and again, it depends on the arts discipline, but it's open to, if you have an idea or an interested in doing something, or undertaking an initiative, that the point of it is like a kind of skill development, your artistic skill development, that falls into the category of a professional development grant. Right. Now, a creation grant is, hey, I have an idea, it's not finalized, but I want to take time out to work on a book, to work on writing songs for an album, whatever your art discipline is. When you're in that creation phase, you can apply to get funding strictly to work on that art.
And that's really key, I think, for emerging artists to realize that even if the project isn't fully formed, but they want to get funds in order to explore, do research, collaborate, all of that falls under what would be a creation grant. Yeah. So given the fact that some of these ideas might not be that fleshed out, what would you say, marks sort of when an artist is ready to apply for a creation grant?
Right. It's funny. I'm of the mind that once you have the idea, you're ready to apply for the grant. Now, what you want to do at that point is think about, so you have your idea, so what is the idea? But then you need to start thinking about why you want to do this, how you're going to go about this process, how you're going to explore this idea, and, when and where this could happen. Could also be a consideration, again, depending on the program you're applying to. But really, as long as you have the idea and it's something that you can articulate, hey, I have this idea, I'm working in this artistic medium, and I want to explore this for this reason. You're ready to apply for that grant. And then the next step then is to, find the grant program that best applies and best supports that work. And then I would say reach out to the grant program manager or program officer, and have a conversation if you're not sure what the next steps will be.
That's such a key tip, because I feel like, that list sometimes can just appear on, an organization's website, and you don't really feel like you're necessarily ready. But sometimes having that conversation with a grant officer who's running that program stream can help you understand if you are ready or not. And they're there to sort of help you walk through that process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel personally that's like a major part of the role, a part of the job. I'm out at events, well, not so much in this, COVID world we're living in, but, pre-lockdown, out at events, meeting artists. I often had conversations with artists that went something like, hey, I do this. And then I say, have you applied to Toronto Arts Council? And they say no. And the reasons, are often, I didn't think that was for me, or I didn't even know about this. And, or I did know about it, but when I read it, I interpreted the guidelines in this very narrow or limited way and excluded myself. So, I'm always encouraging folks to, if there's a phone number or an email listed, call that person, email that person, and get the information you want.
Absolutely. Be proactive, take your career in your own hands, and make sure you apply. That's a key message. So for yourself personally as an artist, have you applied for a creation grant? Could you give us an example of what that process was like?
Yeah, so I've applied for 3 creation grants for myself in the time in my life. And so I received one of the 3, so I was, a relative, it's a good batting average if you're playing baseball. And, it was quite intimidating the first time around. At that time, I had just started doing a bit of grant writing as a job. I was learning about grant writing. Shout out to Vivian Scott at Dance Immersion who, mentored me.
Nice.
And, Vivian also put the idea in my head that, you can apply to do this, stuff that you're doing, Kevin. So I did find it intimidating, largely because, one, there's that self-doubt I think a lot of artists have, and I think a lot of Black artists have. Because in my mind, the reality at that time was accessing the information was a little bit more difficult than it is now. So, and the first grant I applied for was a Canada Council grant.
Right.
And
so right at the top.
Yeah. At the time too, because, keeping in mind I'm, doing spoken word. At that time I was living in Markham, so not eligible for Toronto Arts Council, and they actually didn't even have, I don't think at that time oral storytelling and spoken word wasn't part of the literary program at the time. There might have been something similar with the Ontario Arts Council. So Canada Council was the one that had an oral storytelling program. So, I was limited in what my options were. But yeah, it was really, even though I had a little bit of experience at that time, working at Dance Immersion, writing a grant for myself was intimidating because I really wasn't sure how to write about myself.
Right.
There was, I wasn't sure, even tackling the budget, even though I had seen Vivian do budgets for Dance Immersion, kind of looked over her shoulder at what she was doing. When it came down to things like how much to pay myself, how much to, because I was, thinking about, equipment I wanted to use, I wanted recording equipment, or like it was just this huge. It seemed like a huge undertaking in my brain. But I wrote it, and first time I was not lucky. To be honest,
and that's part of the process too for folks to realize,
absolutely.
right? Like you have to write it, you have to build that muscle, you have to get comfortable articulating yourself and what this project means, which is a good exercise, whether or not you're, trying to secure funds through a private sponsor, going to run your own GoFundMe, or going to ultimately have to write, an artist statement about what this work is about. So it's a good exercise to go through, regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, it is, all these grant programs are very competitive, and not receiving a grant is not a commentary on the quality of your art. Lots of great artists, great projects aren't going to get funded. So I urge artists to keep that in mind as well. The other thing, though, whenever I tell this story that I think is notable, and it reinforces the point somewhat that, it's not always just about the quality of your artistry, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about how the decisions are made,
right.
How these grant decisions are made, because, I didn't get the grant. I was disappointed, and I forgot about it, and went about my life. And then a year later, the deadline came up again. I was like, oh, I should apply again. And I submitted the exact same application. I just changed dates. I didn't change anything else. And this time I did get it. Now it was a different, jury, so a different group of people are looking at the application. And I found out much later that, someone in the room who was familiar with my work was able to speak to, I've seen Kevin perform, and oh yeah, he's this, he's that,
So the room was different.
The room was different.
It's another year. There's another round of applications, and so that's as well an important consideration as much sort of as you're working on things, and you may or may not be successful, but recognizing a bit more about and we'll definitely go over that, the jury process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
you got it the second time.
I did get it the second time.
Nice.
And the third time not so lucky, but it's and the third time was I think an Ontario Arts Council one, but once you do it the first time is always really difficult. And that self-doubt, I'm sure there are artists out there who don't have that. I'm sure, I don't know, maybe Jay-Z never doubted himself. He doesn't seem like the dude who doubted himself. But, once you go through the process a few times, it becomes relatively straightforward.
Proper. So one thing that we always hear from emerging artists is that they experience difficulties, particularly in describing their work. And I think that that's particularly a challenge for Black artists, knowing that the granting system and the arts sector is largely based on like a Eurocentric framework, and our art disciplines, our art expression doesn't always fit into that. So, adding on to that as another layer, you may be self-taught. And so the language that you use to describe your work might not fit in with the vernacular, the language that's used if you go to like an art school. So how do you sort of reconcile those two things? How would you suggest Black artists reconcile that so that they can, articulate their work in a way that, the integrity of it remains true, but then there's also the value of it is communicated to these juries and funding bodies?
Right. It's a difficult line to kind of walk, because I do feel that artists in general, when you're applying, it's really important to be able to contextualize your work within some kind of artistic tradition or aesthetic tradition, whatever it may be. But as Black artists, there is an added layer of like these systems weren't set up with your artwork, your artistry in mind. So things are getting better. Things have improved. The juries the pools that make these decisions are diversified. We're getting more voices in there with a wider range of expertise that can speak to, Black art aesthetics and things. But you do have to find a way to be able to talk about really why your art is important, why your art is important, why. And what is good about it,
right?
And these things are always subjective, even if we take this layer of identity, or racial identity out of it, these things are always subjective. But, you really need to take that opportunity to tell the story as well. If I can tell a little bit of an anecdote about grants I've written for artists, for other artists.
Right.
There's an MC in Toronto, wrote a grant for her and for Ontario Arts Council. And in writing the grant, I did not assume that the panel would be familiar with hip hop, nor did I assume they would be familiar with Toronto hip hop.
Right.
So I talked a little bit about hip hop aesthetics in writing the grant, briefly talked about, Toronto's hip hop history.
So you went back to
I
80s New York. This is hip hop as musical genre. This is where it came from.
This is what it's about.
Right.
And, then Toronto hip hop, and then women in hip hop, and why this artist is a great lyricist, themes that she talks about, and in her work, and why this new project is important to Toronto hip hop, important to her career. That grant was successful. Another example with another female artist, Jamaican born, been living in Toronto maybe 15, 20 years now. Simultaneously an emerging artist and an older artist because they didn't really start performing until a little later in life. But reggae and dancehall as a performance, same thing. I talked about history of reggae music, history of reggae in Toronto, history of women in dancehall, and why her art fits into that continuum. Right, so those kind of things are important, and like I was saying before, they're important regardless of your social location and your identity. But for Black artists, I think it's unfortunately the reality is it's really incumbent upon them to write about themselves in those
and
ways.
Make those connections.
Yeah,
which in a way too, speaks to a lot of the ways in which art coming out of this city is going to be unique and groundbreaking.
Yeah.
So you really do have to do that work to say, this is a road. It's already been paved a bit by these folks. Here's who came before me, and here's how I'm hoping to expand the sound or expand the literary narratives about our city or expand the visual narrative of our city or our people. And here's how it advances that.
Yeah.
So I agree. It's a good principle in general for you as an artist to be able to do is to contextualize yourself in this. You're not the first person to do this.
Yeah.
So who else has been in this scene, and how are you contributing to this conversation?
Yeah.
Respect your elders, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd also just want to add too that there is often that concern about language. You did mention that, not finding the right language. There's grant speak, how grants are supposed to be written and read. At Toronto Arts Council, we've made an effort to simplify applications and simplify the program guidelines. But there still is that element of grant speak, or people fear that they need to speak a certain way. And I increasingly believe that that's not necessarily the case anymore. Speak in your own voice. Just be as clear about your vision. All those things we talked about, contextualizing where you fit in. Yes, those are important. But speak in your own voice, but just be as clear as possible about it.
Right. So if you were to complete your application and give it to someone who didn't work at all in the arts, they should be able to read it, review it, and understand the nature of your project.
Yeah.
And that would be sort of a good litmus test of, is this working or not?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move a bit into the decision-making process. So for both the Toronto Arts Council, Ontario Arts Council, and Canada Council for the Arts, so all three levels of government have granting streams for artists in a range of disciplines, and they all have creation grants. What is the decision-making process like? So it's typically a jury, selection committee. How does that work?
Yeah, so program managers or officers don't make the decisions at all. We're responsible for convening a jury of peers. So, if it's, a visual media arts jury, we get together a group of visual and media arts practitioners who are, represent a broad range of perspectives. So, if you're applying for visual and media arts, not everyone is going to be, not everyone on that panel is going to be, someone who works with, I don't know,
Oil
or acrylic. Like there will be various, mediums presented, people of different ages, different backgrounds, and all the applications are sent to the panel. They grade them, they mark them. For TAC, it's on a 1 to 5. 1 meaning this is not fundable. 5 meaning absolutely fundable, or yes, we're going to fund this. Anything over 3 is what Toronto Arts Council considers a project of merit, meaning if we had all the money in the world, anything over 3 would get funded. So yeah, the jury, they read and score the applications ahead of time, and then we get them together. We've been doing it by Zoom these days. And then we have discussions about all the projects, and then we rescore them because sometimes the conversation changes people's feelings, and essentially the things that get, or the top ranked applications get funded.
Okay. So really, there's a number of factors. The number of applications, the people in the room, of course, how well written your application is, and then sort of how much competition there is given the number of applications and the number of sort of well-written ones, and the funding pot, which could vary year to year.
Yeah, absolutely. And just speaking to how strong like the applications tend to be, it is very rare. So I'm working community arts, but it's very rare when I look, because I read all the applications as well, and I read the applications to create a summary.
You're in there.
Yeah. I have to know what's happening.
Right.
Very rarely do I read an application and think, this is absolutely not going to get funded. It's generally, I'm like, oh yeah, I could see this getting funded.
Right.
And, speaking to that scoring framework I described, I had a recent round through community arts where we had just under 60 applications. Only 7 of those applications didn't score 3 or higher.
Wow.
Right? So it is very competitive. And so at Toronto Arts Council, the visual and media arts, the music program, and I think the theater program were the most, like they receive the most applications. They regularly receive like 300-400 applications.
Wow.
Right. So, but they fund, maybe a third, maybe a quarter of those. Not because we wouldn't want to fund more, but we just don't have enough money. So advocate for more funding for arts funders. That's
always.
That's also the message.
Always. I often hear for folks like getting started is the most difficult thing, especially when it's something you've never done before. Maybe you've set up the online profile, that you qualify for this grant and that it makes sense for your project, but you're kind of like, how do I get started? Like, this is a big undertaking and it might be intimidating. How would you suggest an emerging artist starts for the first time or a returning? Yeah.
Well, I kind of referenced this before, but one of the things I always talk about when I do a grant writing session, and it's actually in my, I have various PowerPoint presentations. I talk about whatever your idea is or whatever your project is, breaking it down by the 5 W's and the H. What do you want to do? Why? When? Where? With who? And how? And just answer those questions as clearly and specifically as you can. And if you do that, you will actually have all the information you need to start writing a grant. Like any question that's thrown at you, those are the questions we're asking you. We want to know who you are, why you're doing this project, when's it going to happen,
who you're collaborating
with.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then, the most successful grants are always the ones that have a very clear idea of what they want to do and, and why they want to do it. I've seen, really good grants that just, it's not like paragraph after paragraph. It's like, hey, my name is so-and-so. I'm a hip hop artist. I've been working like this. I make my own beats. My inspirations are this. I do this. If I get this money, I'm going to do this. Like just be very straightforward. Like you need to be detailed. Like there has to be detail about how you're going to do this, but you can also just be very straightforward and very clear. And so ask yourself those questions.
And just like talk it out or write it out as an initial step.
Yeah, and because if you and then once you do that too, even if in conversations with friends, other peers, explain the project to them.
Yeah.
And if you have difficulty explaining the project to someone, you're going to have difficulty writing the grant.
And also, I think that process of talking to people is actually really key because they will have questions.
Right.
And so they will deepen your understanding of your own project, or they'll ask questions of like, oh, I never thought of that. So that might as well for you have a little light bulb. You're like, oh yeah, I need to like do some more work on like how is this all going to happen if I'm recording and then I'm not launching for another 6 months. Like what am I doing in that time or whatever the details are. Yeah, it's a good sort of process. What about let's get into some of the specificity of what's usually required for a grant. So things like support materials. I know for a lot of emerging artists, starting out doing an application, it asks for a CV sometimes or a link to a portfolio, and you might not have a lot of documentation of things that you've done. How would you sort of go around or create a strong body of work to support a grant?
To a certain degree, there's no getting around, not having like a lengthy body of work. But I would say, I think it's then incumbent upon you at that point to, one, whatever you do have, present the best stuff possible. Right? But secondly, what then becomes really important is a strong artistic statement. Right? So being able to talk about, using that support material, whatever you're submitting, within your CV, or your artistic statement, like what you're submitting is kind of like a jumping off point. So the person can look at this and say, oh yeah, this is a skilled, whatever, clay, sculpture, blah, 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 blah. And then looking through your artistic statement and talking about what inspired you, what you're going to do, and how this piece is representative of both your skill and what you were planning to do. Like, I think that is what you have to do at that point.
Right.
Also, I think a lot of emerging artists get caught in there's an idea that being a professional artist means like, oh, I've been in the AGO, or I've, my film was
recognized,
right,
I'm celebrated,
right,
I'm awarded.
Right. But, for TAC purposes, and I'm fairly certain it's similar at Ontario Arts Council. I know Canada Council is a little more finicky. But for TAC, as long as people working within that same genre or discipline would recognize you as a professional as well, and you've been paid or something, or exhibited, that's good enough for us as your professional.
You're an artist.
You're an artist. Yeah. So anything you've done, if you and your friends have done an exhibit out of a space you rented out and people came and paid for work, you are a professional artist. So sometimes I think, I talk to artists and they say, oh, I haven't done much. And when I say, okay, what have you done? They've actually done a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't meet.
To them in their mind, it's
right.
not professional because, certain reps didn't
right.
come, or it wasn't acknowledged in Canadian art, or whatever the case may be. We have these ideals of what qualifies as professional.
Yeah.
And we create a lot of spaces and art outside of that.
Yeah.
In gym, in your parking lot, with your friends, and those, movements and moments and exhibitions can have significant impact or grow, the careers of these artists, but they don't still see that initial work or initial exhibition or initial performance, as part of their career trajectory. Yeah. And it's important that that's sort of all documented. And seen as part of your experience and your creative output.
Yeah.
Like if you created something and people consumed it and they were like, yeah, that, like they're there for it, they participated in it, they paid for it. That's all part of you being a professional artist. Because I get there's a lot of hesitation, people being like, I'm an artist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like something you just said there too about documenting things. It's important to document everything you do.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks my age and older, make fun of these millennials and these young folks because they're already all on the Instagram or whatever social media. But I think it's such an effective tool for documenting what you're doing, and as artists, it's so powerful that way.
Mm-hmm.
You can,
behind the scenes, the final output, all of that can be really, if it's well done, can demonstrate that you have the skill sets to be able to produce well.
Yeah.
And is it important that the documentation and the support material reflects the discipline that you're applying for the grant in?
Absolutely. So, if you're applying for, a music project, you want support material, and you might be, a very multidisciplinary artist. You might be a great singer-songwriter. You might be a beat maker as well, and you do installation art. That's all great. But if you're applying for a music grant, you can mention some of those things in your bio or your CV, speaking to, the range of artistic work you do.
Creative work, yeah.
But what you're submitting, if it's for, music creation,
there'll be people around the table who are into music and they want to hear your music.
Exactly.
Don't put the little installation
right.
thing, even though it won awards.
Right. Yeah. They're not interested in that.
We're not.
No.
Yeah. Stay focused.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so I guess, types of support material, maybe going through some of the different disciplines, what could people consider supporting?
Okay, so let's say, literary, generally speaking, it's going to be like a sample of your writing, right? So at Toronto Arts Council, it's going to be, for the literary program at TAC, we only support like creation. There's no like publishing component, right? So submit something you're working on, and generally it's what you submit is what you're working on that you want to get funded to continue working on, right?
So you're submitting a draft.
Yes. And as a side note too, it's blind juries, so people just read your work. They don't know who they're reading for the literary program. And for dance, if it's creation, you'll want to submit some kind of choreographic ideas. You'll, in the written components, you talk about what your ideas are, but the support material, you're going to want to show, something that reflects some of your choreographic ideas as described in, the application. Doesn't necessarily have to be fully polished, but it should really evoke, the kind of artistic themes mentioned in the application. Visual and media arts, similar.
For dance, would you be able to submit like previous performances?
You could, but you would want, and you in this case, you'd probably want to call the dance program manager for clarification. But again, it would have to have some kind of relation to what it is you're
building on this body of work.
Yeah, and and for music, similar to like there's music. The music program has there's music creation, and it could be like demo stage, recording stage. Like there's different stages that you can apply for, or productions. I can't remember if they call it recording production. There are different stages at TAC. I'm talking specifically about TAC. But for the creation, what you submit is because it is about creating new work, right? So it doesn't mean though that you can't have a sketch of the song or anything like that. But it shouldn't be like a finished Billboard. It's already been on Billboard charts song. That's not what this is about. This is about
creating something in this vein.
Yeah.
Here's a little teaser beat.
Yeah.
Here's a little 1-2 lyric.
Yeah.
And I'm out.
Yeah. So and that's at TAC as it currently stands. That's how it is throughout all the disciplines. That have that kind of funding for a specific creation component.
Okay. And for visual arts, the same?
Yes. Yes. Now you'll you'll want to, actually, you know what? I can't 100% say with 100% certainty, but I'm fairly certain. We can fact check this.
Fact check, yeah.
But yeah, that, you submit something that, whether it's a sketch of something that you're then going to blow up and, do a full acrylic treatment of it, or, something, along those lines that's
Right.
part of the process and also speaks to the themes you've discussed in your.
So if you were exploring, Black masculinity in the photographic form, then you might have a photo of,
Right.
A Black man that you've photographed,
Yeah.
style, etc., for them
Yeah.
to consider. So it's kind of like a draft, the
Yeah.
test shot, the test beat, the test song. Whatever your draft is, that's what you're submitting for a creation grant.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you touched a bit earlier on budgets and sort of your own personal experience of like, how do we break this all down? What do I pay myself? Can you talk a bit about some of the component parts and specifically, how do you gauge what you should pay yourself? Because that is part of the fees that go into an artistic creation grant.
Yeah. So, one of the unfortunate things about the arts sector is that like the pay scales across disciplines are so different. What dance pays versus music versus visual media arts, it's so different. There's no one-stop shop to figure out these fees. However, things like CARFAC are really great.
What is CARFAC?
So it's like a union for artists. It offers, different like pay ranges according to what kind of arts activity you're undertaking. So, if you're doing an exhibition, if you're teaching a workshop, and you have XYZ amount of experience, they have a model that describes what you should typically be charging for that service or being compensated for those services and that kind of work.
So you could go to CARFAC's website, look at the kind of activity that you're going to be doing. Say you're, getting a creation grant to produce a new body of work, and then you're going to exhibit it with 3 other people. And you could look at, what an artist should be paid for, a commission or for exhibiting work in a group show, and then based on those fees, use that as your sort of estimate for what you're going to pay yourself.
Yeah. And, so for writers, there's there's different writers guilds and there's playwrights guilds. For dancers, things like CADA are, worth investigating. And again, they'll have, fees, what people should be charging and should be getting paid. Having said all that, you go to whether it's CARFAC or CADA and you get this data. I think it's important, regardless of what discipline you're working in, to pay yourself a very healthy amount when you're putting together grants. Artists, perhaps the biggest mistake first-time artists make when writing a grant is, if I don't pay myself so much, or I try to stretch the money as far as possible, it'll look better and they'll more want to fund me. That's actually not how it works. Toronto Arts Council is committed to paying professional artists and seeing them being paid at a rate that's, comes out almost to like a living wage, right? Mm-hmm. That if you were doing this project over the course of a year, you would be paid a living wage. So, keep that in mind. If you would actually charge $500 an hour to teach a dance workshop or your time, that's how much a day's worth of your time would take. And you're going to be writing for 3 weeks, and it's how many days? Calculate it on that basis,
Don't shortchange yourself.
Yeah. Don't do that.
Yeah. No. So it's really about looking at the sort of discrete activities that you're doing. Are you working for a couple of days? Are you doing this over the course of 6 months? How much time are you sort of actually working? And then coming up with a rate that's reasonable, that's like fair to actually your living, and then calculate that and put it in there.
Yeah. And, keep in mind, and you remember too, everyone on that panel, if it's a visual arts, they're all visual artists. So they know what the realities are. And so it works the other way too. Don't overinflate it, because they will look at it and be like, this person is, Yeah.
Like if it really costs $500 to print work, don't say it costs $2,500. Right.
Yeah.
And so doing some of that pre-work to just think through your project a bit, do some calls to a couple of vendors or, collaborators and see what they would charge is also sort of helpful to make sure the budget's accurate.
Yeah.
Are there any other missteps that you see artists making in sort of like their first time application? Budgets?
No, that's really the biggest one. Because not every funding program at TAC has a budget requirement. Some of them are, it's just a flat, if you get it, you're gonna get $5,000 or you're gonna get $10,000,
Right.
whatever. But the ones that do have a budget, the templates are set up in a way that your revenues and your expenses have to match, right? So it's kind of, I don't want to say foolproof, but as long as they add up, like it's hard to mess it up.
Yeah.
And frankly, if it's not proper, we call you and say, hey, it's not adding up. You need to tweak this,
Yeah.
and here's how you can tweak
Right.
it.
So your budget will be balanced regardless.
Yeah.
It's more a question of, do these line items make
Yeah.
sense? And that's the sort of test you want to make sure you pass, is that people sitting around the table would look at it and say, yeah, you should be paying yourself $5,000 for this 2-month project based on the amount of time you're working for it. And yep, your collaborator should get $1,500 because that's the rate that they said that they would pay. And that's all reasonable and fair. And you're gonna spend $3,000 on materials. That makes a lot of sense. Just being able to pass a nod test of like, this makes sense.
Yeah, and also too, one of the things I say about budgets is like a budget for a grant is kind of your entire project translated into money, into numbers, into
Right.
resources. So if in your application you talked about X, Y, Z, when they look at your budget, they should say, oh yes, this all makes sense. This all adds up based on what they said they were going to do.
Right.
You know?
And I have heard people say, like, you said you're going to, put your work into this amazing exhibit, but then like the gallery fee isn't there. So then
Right.
it makes us kind of question like, oh, did you really think this out? Because there's no gallery fee.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Your whole budget is your whole project
Yes.
in
Yeah.
numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we move on to other kinds of support material, some grant applications ask for things like letters of support. How do juries sort of leverage those kinds of documents? Like what are they useful for?
So, in situations when you're talking about, oh, you're going to have an exhibit at such and such gallery, you'll need to provide proof that that's actually going to be the case, right?
Mhm.
So, so that might require you to get a letter from whichever curator, whichever gallery saying, yes, we are going to exhibit XYZ's work on XY date and time, So that's the value in that sort of thing. For creation grants, though, like unless you're creating and talking about it in that specific way that I just mentioned, that I'm creating with the express purpose of doing this exhibit a year and a half, 2 years down the road.
Mhm.
Like it's not necessarily
Right. So firm.
yeah, right? It's not a big deal for creation grants to have those kind of support letters or reference letters. They more come into play for if you're doing production or if you're doing a community arts project and you're working in a particular community center, how do we know you have this relationship with, this particular community? Now, that's not to say if you're an artist and you have like some reference of a letter of support from a great artist or a mentor or someone, add it. It does add color, and adds texture and like, oh, okay, yeah, this person is doing what they say they're doing.
Mhm.
Absolutely. But it's not often like a mandatory component of an application.
Okay. And then reference letters, how do those factor into the application process?
Similar, it's a similar. I can't think of, and again, working, since I've been on this side of the fence, I'm working in the community arts perspective, and the reference. I cannot think of a situation where someone didn't get an application because they didn't have a reference letter. You know what I mean? Like that would own like the kind of questions. Yeah, that's never come up in a room that I've been in. Like, oh well, they don't have a reference letter. Everything else they've said doesn't matter, right? That's never come up. But again, it doesn't hurt to have a reference letter.
Right.
And so if it's someone you've worked with, someone who's familiar with your work, and and it does help if if it's someone who has some kind of expertise within that field that you're working in. So if you're a sculptor and you're applying to do this thing, and someone who's got expertise there, says, hey, yeah, you know, I've worked with them. And
could it be useful for someone who's an emerging artist who might not be as well known to get a reference letter from someone who's a bit more established or well known?
yes, absolutely. You know, yeah, it would definitely speak to, you know, your capacity as an artist, your skill. And I don't think, well, I was going to say, I don't think this needs to be said, but maybe it does, that if you are going to get those reference letters from someone, you know, always be on the up and up with, like, if you got a reference letter from someone, you know, last year, and, you know, a year later's pat, you might still want to call them up and say, hey, I'm going to use that reference letter again, just to, you know, give them the heads up.
Right. Because sometimes you will call or follow up.
Yeah,
Okay.
it happens.
Okay.
Or you know, we've occasionally seen situations where a panel is, oh, they've got a reference letter from such and such person. Oh, that's my partner, and or that's me, and oh, I retracted this, or you know, what I mean, things have changed. You know, so you might want to always make sure that you nurture those relationships.
Details are all tied up.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good insight. And so I think, you know, just again, to go over sort of the process, the best way to approach someone about getting a reference letter.
Yeah. I personally, I always think it's, you know, it behooves you to have established a relationship with someone.
You're not cold calling them.
Yeah.
It's not your first conversation.
No.
You didn't see them on road by chance and be like, hey.
No. And so, you know, it speaks to the importance of like developing networks, of building relationships. So, you know, you want to nurture those relationships, not because you're a mercenary and you know you're going to want a reference letter down the road, but you might need a reference letter down the road. So, you know, nurture those relationships. So, you know, people, you know, tap into your networks. You know, and you know, don't be afraid to ask. You know, my mom always told me the worst you can hear is no, and you're in the same position you were in anyway. Right. So,
wise words.
You know, do that. And, you know, I know the challenge for a lot of emerging artists is maybe they don't have those networks yet, or those networks.
But can it be a peer?
It can be. It can be. Now, it would be stronger. You know, it can be stronger if it's some established person or whatever. But it can, you know, it can definitely be a peer. You know, the panel, like, it's not going to hurt. The panel might say, oh, well, this is their friend, or it's clear, but that's fine. Like, if they're able to speak about you within their reference letter, speak about your work or your artistry in a kind of, you know, tangible, meaningful way.
Yeah, adding that context that we spoke earlier about of what you do and how it fits into this sort of larger scene or artistic canon still has value.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Good to know. So I think my final question to you is just, you know, thinking about the opportunities that are available to artists right now and to emerging Black artists. Is there anything that you would share to them specifically about applying to grants?
Well, you know, I kind of referenced earlier about, you know, these systems that we currently have are great. You know, there aren't many countries in the world that actually have arts funding systems the way we have, you know, but they operate still, you know, it's getting better, but still kind of Eurocentric colonial lens. So that's the bad news, or, you know, that's the reality, right? However, things have never been better. Like, in terms of a recognition from the arts funders that we haven't been doing enough to support, to nurture, to develop Black artists. You know, generations of Black artists in this country have been neglected and ignored. And that is the unfortunate history and the reality. But the good thing is, and the improving thing is that this is the best time, the best it's ever been, I think, for a Black artist seeking support from an arts funder. So if you've ever, you know, if you've been thinking about and you've been on the fence, the time is now. The time is now.
Right. Yeah. So get your calendar organized.
Yeah.
You know, there's actually a couple websites I know that have aggregated when different grants are available. So we'll be sure to put those in the notes for this session. But get your calendar, get your Google Calendar marked, and sort of start the process of mapping out your next creation grant so that you can advance your career.
Absolutely. And, not just because I'm sitting here, stay connected and support organizations like the NIA Center and other Black-led organizations. As much as I like the work that we do at TAC, and I think we're doing better, and we're going to be offering better service to Black artists. Organizations like NIA, this is what you do and what you have been doing.
We've been Black.
Right. So, continue to do that as well. And, I'm on your mailing list and I see all the things that NIA Center is doing, and I'm always like, yes, yes.
Well, we hope that artists can benefit more and more from the sessions that we're doing and from seeing these shifts in the sector from, statements of support really change and turn into, sort of actionable opportunities. And we're seeing that more and more, and we're hoping that that's, where the wave continues to go, and we'll be pushing for that. So thank you so much for joining us and supporting artists who are watching today and better understanding arts. Studying grants and how to get them, and ultimately how to push their careers forward.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Kevin.